Hello, this is Dr. Joe Muscolino. The following is an AI-generated simulated podcast of the contents of my ebook. I've created this and providing this because I believe that it is a very casual way and a comfortable way of listening to and absorbing the information. I hope you do enjoy it.
Ever rolled your ankle and thought, ugh, not again? We're going deep on ankle sprains this time, those annoyingly common injuries that most of us just gotta shrug off.
It gets easy to downplay them, right?
Totally.
But get this, understanding what's actually happening in those twists and pops, that's key to really bouncing back. And more importantly, making sure you're not setting yourself up for round two. You know?
All about prevention.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this medical guide on ankle sprains, ready to geek out a little. First off, for those of us who, skipped anatomy class, what's actually going on in there?
Okay, so we think ankle, we think one joint, right? But there's this other important bit most people don't even realize.
Oh?
So below that main ankle joint, where your shin bone, the tibia, meets the talus, that's your ankle bone. There's this other joint called the subtalar joint. It's where that talus bone meets the heel bone, calcaneus. And this little guy, that's usually the main culprit in those inward ankle rolls. You know, those inversion sprains everyone talks about?
Okay, so it's not just a simple hinge then. It's like this whole system working together down there.
Exactly. A lot more complex than people realize.
So when we do sprain our ankle, what's actually getting stretched or torn? It's those ligaments, right?
You got it. Ligaments, those tough, kind of sort of stretchy bands, they're the things holding those bones together. And with these inward sprains, the ones on the outer part of your ankle, they're taking the brunt of the force.
Makes sense. They're trying to hold on for dear life when your foot rolls in like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, there's this one ligament gets all the attention, the anterior talofibular ligament, ATFL for short. This one's kind of infamous for being, well, the weak link. Think of a rubber band, right? Stretch it too far.
Snap.
Exactly. Too much force and it can tear.
Ouch. Poor ATFL. So, no wonder the guide says these inversion sprains are the most common. Sounds like our ankles are practically designed to twist inward.
Well, think about it. Uneven ground, you've got your own momentum moving forward, and bam, inward roll.
Recipe for disaster.
And to make matters worse, often you're also pointing your foot down. That plant reflection adds even more stress.
Like if you misjudge a step off a curb, your foot just crumples under you.
Exactly.
Not fun. Been there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the biomechanics working against us, ligaments working overtime. But there's this cycle of laxity thing the guide mentions. That caught my eye. What's that all about?
Laxity, it basically means looseness. Ligaments are supposed to stretch, but overstretch them, and they lose some of their, their tightness.
Become like a loose rubber band.
Exactly. Lost its snap.
So one sprain makes you more likely to have another.
Unfortunately, yeah. It's a vicious cycle.
That's rough.
Which is why rehab is so important. It's not just letting the initial injury heal. It's about strengthening those supporting structures so it doesn't just happen again.
Which is where those, what are they called? Evereater muscles? The guy talked about those.
Yes.
Important for ankle stability.
It's crucial. These muscles, they're on the outer part of your lower leg. They're like the anti-roll system. Brakes for your ankle, stopping you from twisting too far in.
Okay.
Weak everator muscles. That's in like worn out brakes. More likely to skid out of control.
So strong evergers, it's like having a good set of brakes for your ankles. Makes sense. But what happens when those brakes fail, right? We end up with the ankle sprain. The guide talks about acute versus chronic ankle sprains. What's the difference there?
That's an important distinction because the way you approach each stage is different. Acute, that's your initial injury, right? First few days or weeks, pain, swelling, inflammation.
Ice, elevation, hobbling around.
Exactly. Think rice, rest, ice, compression, elevation.
Ah, yes, the classic Ricey protocol.
Exactly. So acute is all about damage control, letting your body kind of do its thing, that initial healing.
Makes sense. So then chronic sprains, that's like when those ankle issues stick around.
Exactly. So we're talking weeks, months, even years after that initial sprain. You've got that lingering weakness, stiffness, that feeling like it could just give way again. You know that feeling.
Which is probably why that old ankle sprain from high school still bugs me sometimes.
Could be.
Even though, the initial pain is long gone, something's still a little off in there.
Yeah.
So this is where I'm guessing that hands-on approach comes in. The guide mentioned manual therapy for both acute and chronic ankle sprains. What is that exactly?
So that's basically a fancy way of saying it's skilled hands-on techniques.
Okay.
to address issues in the muscles, tendons, joints. Think of it like a more targeted form of massage therapy, really trying to get those tissues moving and working better.
So more than just a spa day for your ankle.
Right.
What kind of techniques are we talking about here?
So in that acute phase, when everything is super swollen, tender, we use really gentle techniques like effleurage.
Yeah, we'll have to say that 3 times fast.
Right. Basically, it's just light rhythmic stroking, encourages fluid drainage, reduces swelling, like gently coaxing those tissues back to their happy place.
Okay, I mean, that actually does sound kind of nice.
Yeah.
But imagine the approach changes for those chronic ankle issues when you're dealing with like long-standing tightness, restrictions.
Absolutely. For chronic sprains, we might do something like trigger point therapy.
Trigger point, yeah.
Ever had those like tight, knotted areas in a muscle? Feels like
Yeah.
a little pea or a band.
Oh, yeah.
Those are trigger points. They can really be troublemakers. Reefer pain, limit movement. We're talking specific pressure to release those knots.
It's amazing how these things, can wreak havoc. Tiny little knot in a muscle can throw off your whole ankle. What about the joint itself? The guide mentioned joint mobilization.
Yeah, so with that, we're using these very specific controlled movements,
Yeah.
really trying to restore the normal mechanics of the joint, help it remember how to, move smoothly and freely again.
Yeah.
Think of it like gently guiding the bones back into their happy place.
So it's not just addressing the ankle. It's like looking at the surrounding muscles, tissues, all the things that could be contributing to the problem. It's really a whole body approach to what seems like this very isolated injury.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting because the guide talks about how often manual therapists will assess and even treat areas beyond just the ankle.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Looking at muscles in your calf, your thigh, even your back.
Wow. Okay. Why so far up?
Well, it all comes down to how our bodies compensate for injuries,
Right, because if you're favoring that wonky ankle, then your other leg is picking up the slack, hips are twisting, and suddenly your back's like, what's going on up there?
Exactly. Domino effect.
Yeah.
Our bodies are amazingly adaptable. They figure out ways to keep us moving, even when something's not right. But those compensations, it's helpful in the short term, long term, can be a problem if you don't address them.
Like putting a Band-Aid on a bigger issue.
Exactly.
Speaking of seeing the bigger picture, the guide had that case study. The runner, was his name Joe?
Joe? Yep.
Persistent ankle sprain. Always curious to see how these concepts we're talking about, how they actually play out in real life. What stood out to you about his case?
Joe's case, I thought, was a great example of how important it is to really understand the mechanism of injury, to figure out the right treatment. Remember that ATFL ligament we were talking about?
That notorious one.
That's the one. So for Joe, he had this very specific tenderness right over that ligament, meaning that's where he took the brunt of the force when he sprained his ankle.
Which tracks with everything we've been talking about.
Yeah.
That inward rolling motion, especially with the foot pointed down, puts that ATFL in a really vulnerable position.
Exactly.
Poor Joe. Glad he got the care he needed.
Me too, me too. And that's really what's so important for anyone dealing with ankle sprains. Doesn't matter if it just happened or if it's something that's been bugging you. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
Understanding the mechanics, figuring out the specific tissues involved, then you can address the individual's needs. That's how you recover properly. And, more importantly, that's how you prevent those pesky repeat sprains.
It really makes you realize we got to treat these ankles with a little more respect.
Right.
No more taking them for granted.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Right.
Yeah.
So true. Speaking of prevention, the guide mentioned proprioception. Big word.
Yeah.
Important for preventing those future ankle sprains.
Yeah.
But I always stumble over that one. What is proprioception exactly? And why is it so important for our ankles?
So think of it like your body's internal GPS system, but for movement.
Okay.
It's that awareness. You don't even think about it, where your joints are in space, even when you're not looking at them.
Okay.
And it relies on these tiny little sensors in your muscles, tendons, ligaments,
Wow.
constantly sending info to the brain.
So your brain's like, ankle's here, foot's pointed that way, we're good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you sprain your ankle, it's like those sensors, they can get a little wonky.
Ah, I see.
Disrupts the communication lines between the sensors and your brain, throws off your proprioception.
So it's like your internal GPS is suddenly giving you like the wrong direction.
Exactly. Makes you more likely to, stumble, twist your ankle again.
Makes total sense. Like your reaction time is a little off because your brain's not getting accurate info. So how do you retrain that? After you've had an ankle sprain, what do you do?
targeted exercises, things like balance exercises,
Okay.
standing on one leg, maybe close your eyes, make it a little more challenging.
Right, up the ante.
Exactly. Or exercises that use uneven surfaces, wobble board, heck, even just a pillow will work.
Interesting.
Forcing your ankle to make those tiny adjustments. It's like relearning those movement patterns.
So you're basically retraining your ankle so it's ready to react quickly, even when it's not the smoothest surface.
Exactly. It's all about that balance, coordination, helping your brain and your body reestablish those neural pathways, regain that sense of awareness.
Wow. Who knew there was so much to ankle sprains? We've been taking them for granted. So as we wrap up this deep dive, any final thoughts for our listeners? What do you really want them to remember?
I think the biggest thing is ankle sprains. They're sneakier than we think. Understanding how those mechanics work, how important those ligaments and ever later muscles are. Rehab isn't just about strength. It's that proprioception piece, too. You do all that. Huge difference in preventing those repeat injuries.
So to our listeners, next time you see a curb, maybe think twice. Engage those ever-shooter muscles. Channel your inner ballerina for some ankle stability. Remember, there's a whole lot more to that ankle than meets the eye. Thanks for diving in with us.
This is Dr. Joe Muscolino again. You've just listened to the AI-generated simulated podcast of the contents located within the ebook. I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast and you found it informational. Thank you.